everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today we are doing my 2022 reading in review. So we're talking about my stats for my reading for last year. So I've got my laptop here with all of my stats on it, so I will be referring to this, but let's just get started. So last year, in total, I read 77 books. Now, when I say books, I do include like novellas, graphic novels, things like that in it as well. I read 77 things, which I think is a little bit less than the previous year. I think in 2021, I read 82 books. So going down a little bit, I kind of knew that was going to happen this year because I was very busy, you know, and so I just got less reading done. However, overall, I really enjoyed a lot of the things that I was reading, which is really what matters. So my average star rating was 3.95 for the year. For the first like half of the year, my average rating was actually above 4 stars. It was like a 4.1 or something like that, which is a great improvement for me because normally my average star rating is 3.6 or below. Like 3.6 is usually on the high end for me, so to have a 3.95 year is great. So I was very excited about that, and I think that reflects the fact that I felt very positive about my reading overall. Now, in terms of the frequency of my ratings, so 4 stars was definitely my most frequent rating, so we'll just go, my lowest rating was a 3 star. I didn't read anything under a 3 star, especially because this year I definitely was just DNFing things if I didn't want to be reading them. However, I will say I didn't have that many DNFs. I didn't encounter so many books this year that I felt like I needed to DNF. Even so 3 star is my lowest rating. I had 8 3-star reads, 11 3.5 star reads, 29 4-star reads, 4 4.5 star reads, and 8 5-star reads. So this year it definitely skews a little bit higher than normal, which makes sense with my average star rating as well. So as I said, my most frequent rating was 4 stars, which is the same as last year. Last year 4 stars was also my most frequent. I think that the difference is that I had more 5-star reads. The year before I had only 2 5 stars, and in 2022 I had 8 5 stars. I also think that I don't have this written down, but I think that I may have had more 3-star or below books the previous year. So I think that also like affected my average. Now, in terms of my number of DNFs, as I said, I did not DNF as many books this year. This year I also was less meticulous about tracking my DNFs. The last 2 years I had been much more specific about tracking the books I was DNFing. I did specific DNF videos, and I just hadn't really been doing that, mostly because I wasn't DNFing as many books, and the ones that I was DNFing I didn't have as strong negative feelings about. They were more often than not ones that I was like, this is going to be at best 3 stars and I just don't feel like spending my time on this. So I don't know exactly how many I DNF'd, but it was between 9 and 12 DNFs for 2022. The previous year I had 32 DNFs. So that's a huge difference in the number of books that I was DNFing. So I think that I've been doing a better job at picking up the things that I wanted to read and the things that I think I will like most, and maybe being more accurate about what I will like. I definitely feel like in 2022 I stayed in my comfort zone more than previous years, which, you know, there's ups and downs to that. There are years where I make much more of an effort to kind of venture out of my comfort zone and try other genres or new authors and things like that, which is great because that's how I learn about new genres and authors and all of that, but it also means that I'm more likely to dislike things. Whereas 2022, I was much more like in my comfort zone. I had a lot more rereads, and so that meant I had a higher rating. So, you know, I think my reading may oscillate between those two methods because I think there's positives to both of them. Anyway, so I encountered fewer books that I needed to DNF in 2022. Then the total number of pages that I read was 26,283, which is fewer than the year before, which makes sense because I read fewer books, because the previous year I had 34,000 and some odd number of pages. So had fewer pages, but that's to be expected. The average number of pages that I read was 341 pages, which is almost exactly the same average as the previous year. So the mix of long and short books that I'm reading seems to be about the same, that it always kind of averages out to about the same number of pages. Okay, then for page frequency. So what I do with this is that I kind of just put categories as like the 100 page range, which is anything from 100 pages to 199 pages, 200 page range, anything from 200 pages to 299 pages. You get it. So those are the categories that we're going with. So the lowest is less than 100 pages. I had 3 reads that were less than 100 pages or fewer than 100 pages. 14 reads that were in the 100 page range. So I think I had that means I had about 14 novella length things, which makes sense. I feel like I read quite a few novellas this year or last year. Then I had 20 books in the 200 page range and 20 books in the 300 page range. And so those were the two ranges. So the 200 page and 300 page were the ones that I had the most frequent books in. Then I had 8 books in the 400 page range, 4 books in the 500 range, 3 in the 600 range, 4 in the 700 range, and 1 book that was over 800 pages, which was Assassin's Fate by Robin Hobb, which was 853 pages or something. My shortest book was Galatea, which was 56 pages, so more of a short story than a book. And then in terms of the genres that I was reading, of course, fantasy was my most popular genre. As I was saying, really stuck to my comfort zone this year. So I had 40 fantasy books that I read. Okay, in 2022, I only read 1 sci-fi book, which was A Prayer for the Crown Shy. One of my intentions for the year had been to read more sci-fi. I read less sci-fi. I'm pretty sure the year before I read 5 or 6 sci-fi. 2022, I read 1, which is why I am so adamant that in 2023 I am going to read sci-fi. I'm gonna have a big push for that. I got vlogs planned. I have a whole TBR running list that I've been making. I am determined to read sci-fi because I just really didn't do that. So 1 sci-fi. I read 8 historical fiction books, 6 historical fiction books, 8 romance books. Those were all contemporary romance because I never really read fantasy romance or historical romance. Then I had 9 contemporary books, 3 nonfiction, which I also would like to read more nonfiction, only 1 poetry, and 10 graphic novels, which I think is more graphic novels than I have read in previous years. Then for the age ranges, adult was my most common age range that I was reading in, so I had 42 adult books that I read, 0 new adult, 21 YA, and 6 middle grade, and 6 that I didn't classify, either because I couldn't figure out what age they were targeted at, or if it was a nonfiction book that isn't targeted to a specific age demographic. So this isn't hugely different from previous years. It seems like I tend to have kind of similar stats around the age ranges year to year. And in terms of release years, I read 19 new releases, so 2022 releases. Then I read 29 books that were released between 1 and 5 years ago, so recent backlist. 17 that were published or released 6 to 10 years ago, 8 that were released 11 to 19 years ago, and then 3 that were over 20 years old. Of the authors that I read, 19 of them were new to me. So 19 of the books that I read this year, this was the first time I was reading a book from that author. My most read authors, I think, are not a surprise, which is this year my most read author is Juliet Marillier. I actually reread a lot of Juliet Marillier books this year, which is great and probably part of why I had such a good reading year and such high rating. So I had 8 Juliet Marillier books that I read, followed by my second most read author was Talia Hibbert with 6 books. I reread a couple of her books and then read a couple of new ones as well. Surprisingly, I was surprised to see Alice Oseman at 5 books, but I guess that's because I read the newest Heartstopper, I reread a couple of the other Heartstoppers, and then I also read Solitaire and the Nick and Charlie novella. So I was surprised by that, but then I was like, oh, I guess that kind of makes sense that she was up there. And then my 4th and 5th most read author, it was a tie between T. Kingfisher and Robin Hobb, both at 4 books. Then in terms of how many standalones versus series books I was reading, for this I'm only counting fiction books, so any like nonfiction, poetry, things like that are not being counted. But 23 of the books that I read were standalones and 33 were a part of a series. Again, very similar to the previous year where I had 22 standalones and 36 series books. So that's also something that seems to be relatively stable. Also, I guess I should have put this at the beginning as part of my like introduction. These numbers may not be like 100% accurate. These are the statistics that I have been keeping track in my reading journal throughout the year, and I try to be as consistent with it as possible, but it is possible that I might be off by 1 or 2 numbers, but it's close enough for me. So, you know, it's more to give a sense of what the year was like, not to have like hyper specific numbers. Okay, back to the rest of this. So speaking of series, talking about how many series I started. In 2022, I actually only started 6 series. Now, when I say started, I don't necessarily mean that I am going to finish that series, but I read the first book in a series. And in this case, I am only counting series that I had not previously read before. So I'm not counting rereads in this. But 6 of the books that I read were the first book in a series, which is not that many. And also looking back at 2021, so the previous year, I read 20 books that were the first book in a series. So that's a big difference. I didn't really do that on purpose, but I am quite happy with that because I was feeling like I was in the middle of a lot of series, and so maybe I kind of subconsciously was just like, you know what, we'll just pull back on this starting of series. Then I did finish 8 series. Now in this one, this is also why my like statistics not 100% accurate, like consistent, is that I did include rereads in my list of series that I finished. I have 2 series that were rereads for me. So the 2 rereads were The Breedy Chronicles by Juliet Marillier and the Shadowfell trilogy by Juliet Marillier. So both of those I started and finished my reread of the full trilogy in 2022. Then I also finished the Ravenswood series by Talia Hibbert, which I think I only read the final book in that series, which is contemporary romance. I also finished the Daevabad trilogy, which I read books 2 and 3, and also the companion short story collection for that series. I finished, I think, the Monk and Robot series because I think it's only going to be a duology, which I'm sad about. I wish that it was going to continue, but I read A Prayer for the Crown Child, which was the second book. So if it is a duology and it is over, then I finished it. I also finished the Founders trilogy by Robert Jackson Bennett. by reading the third book in the trilogy that came out in 2022. And similarly, I finished the Dreamer trilogy, which the third book was released in 2022, so I read that as well. And then the final one is the Fitz and the Fool trilogy. I started and finished the full trilogy in 2022, which also means that I finished The Realm of the Elderlings. Anytime I bring up these books, I am now just being like, I finished The Realm of the Elderlings. I'm just so excited that the fact that I finished it, because I've been reading that massive series for 6 years. So very excited to be done. Then I also had quite a few rereads in 2022. I reread 14 books, which is a lot more, I think, than I have been in previous years since joining BookTube. Before BookTube, I would reread stuff all of the time. I think this happens to a lot of people. It's like you would reread things a lot, then you join BookTube and you stop rereading things because, you know, there's so many, you know about so many more new books, and you want to be reading what's like new and interesting, or have new things to talk about and all of that, and stuff to review or recommend. So you reread stuff less. But this year I reread 14 things. A lot of them were Juliet Marillier books, but I really enjoyed it. I really want to continue rereading more because it was such a great part of my reading for the year. And I rediscovered some things that I really liked, so that was great. All right, then on to format. So the format of the books, here I have physical, audio, and ebook as my 3 options. 35 of the books I read physically, but it wasn't that big of a difference between my physical and my audio reading because 33 of the books that I read were audiobooks. So very close between physical and audio, but I had 7 ebooks. Most of those I think were novellas or short stories or graphic novels. So pretty much focusing on short form things, but still glad to have used ebooks more. I feel like I never really read ebooks even though I have access to them through like Libby and Scribd and stuff. So I was glad to at least have read a couple of ebooks. Then on to my TBR shelf, or should I call it my TBR library, my TBR backlist? I don't know what to call it, but I have a spread in my reading journal and also a shelf on Goodreads where I keep track of the books that I start the year with, so that I can see how many of the books I am reading during the year are coming from my own backlist of my shelf, the things that I started the year with, versus the books that I am buying and reading within the same year. So 11 of the books that I read in 2022 were from that TBR backlist shelf that were things that I started the year with. 17 of the books that I read were books that I bought and read in 2022. But I was surprised that 28 of the books that I read were things that I physically owned, whether they were things I started the year with and from my backlist TBR shelf, or they were things that I bought during the year. But I read 77 books this year. Only 28 of them were things that I owned. That's wild to me. I am also realizing that doesn't make sense. And this is one of those instances where my numbers are clearly off, and yet I don't know why. Because if I physically read, when I was talking about formats, I said 35 of the books I read were physical reads, but only 28 of the books that I read were coming off of my physical TBR. And I know that I didn't take any physical books out from the library. I took out ebooks and audiobooks from the library, but I wasn't borrowing any physical books. Now, a little bit of that difference could be made up from nonfiction books, because I don't count nonfiction, poetry, or graphic novels. Oh, it must be the graphic novels that are making the difference. Okay, because I don't count nonfiction, poetry, or graphic novels on my TBR backlist shelf because I just don't track them there. I track them separately from my fiction books. That must be what makes up the difference. Okay, I was so confused Sorry you had to go through that mental roller coaster with me. Alright, so 11 of the books were from my fiction backlist shelf, and 17 were new fiction that I bought and read. Okay, now let's move on to the last section of this, which is looking at the top 10 TBR that I had set for 2022, and did I read it? Which, it's 50-50. Okay, so of the 10 books that I set, which is actually 12 books because I included an entire trilogy as like one spot, I read 4/6 because it depends on if you count that trilogy as one spot or 3 spots. But the books that I read from my TBR were The Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri, which I believe I gave 4 stars. Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse, which I gave 5 stars. The Hidden City by Michelle West, which I think I gave 3 or 3.5 stars to. And then I read the entire Fitz and the Fool trilogy, which included Fool's Assassin, Fool's Quest, and Assassin's Fate. So Fool's Assassin, I think I gave 4 or 4.5 stars to. Fool's Quest, I think, was 3 or 3.5, and then Assassin's Fate was 4 stars. And then the books that I did not read from this list were The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu, The Lions of Al-Rasan by Guy Gavriel Kay, The Bone Ships by R.J. Barker, The White Mare by Jules Watson, The Bone Shard Emperor by Andrea Stewart, and Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. So I will very soon be doing my top 10 TBR for 2023, but I think I'm going to be doing it, I went about choosing my books a little bit differently, based on the fact that I didn't read like half of the books on this TBR. I have my theories as to why that is, so that will be coming out soon, but I'd love to know how your 2022 reading went. What is your most interesting or most favorite stat from your own reading? Or if you don't track stats, just what is an impression or feeling you had about your reading from 2022? I would love to know. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!